Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, joining you from Lace Partners. As always, thank you very much for joining us for our latest episode. With me today, I have another fabulous co-host who's becoming quite a regular on the team. She's laughing already, so I'll introduce her. It's Debbie Mitchell. Debbie, all right?
Well, you make me sound like a stalker now, but yes, lovely to be back. Thank you. It's been a good week or two.
It's been a really, really good week or two. Debbie's had a week off, and so I had to just simply get her on the next available podcast. And what we're going to talk about today is something that it's a bit of a mixture. Debbie is going to talk a little bit about some work that we are doing around CPO skills, traits, things like that. But what we thought we'd also do is get an external specialist speaker on. And so with that, we've got Graham Norris, who is an organisational psychologist and speaker. Graham, how are you doing?
Very well indeed, Chris. Thank you very much.
It's lovely to have you on. Now, before we go into, because you've produced quite an interesting thought process of 8 aptitudes that I wanted to talk about, and then also link it into some of the stuff that Debbie's doing. But before we do all of that, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? And then I'm going to hit you and Debbie with our fundamentally different question for today.
So yes, I'm an organizational psychologist and futurist, and I speak about change, uncertainty, and futures thinking. And it's really about decision making and how we think about the future. All decisions are about the future, and so how do we think more productively about the future to make better decisions? I have quite a coloured career. I used to be a journalist for about 10 years in financial journalism, and then I moved into marketing and communications, and then I did a doctorate looking at organizational psychology, particularly change and adaptability in the workplace. And when you look at change and adaptability for long enough, then you realize actually if you can see the future coming, you don't have to wait to adapt to it. So that's how I got interested in this space. So I'm looking forward to discussing more about that today.
Yeah, we're obviously, because of the business that we've got, we're going to put a HR lens on it and a CPO lens on it as well. But I'm going to hit you both with the fundamentally different question for today. So the first fundamentally different question that I looked at this morning, I saw an article in the FT, which was around, can a chief happiness officer improve workplace morale? Now, obviously, that's going to be the intention of a chief happiness officer, I'd imagine. But it got me to thinking about interesting job titles and the proliferation of interesting job titles that we've seen. So today's fundamentally different question, Debbie, I'll start with you so that we give Graham a bit of time to think about it. If you can choose any job title, what would you have? And what I would say is that I've got some interesting ones just to kind of whet the appetite. So I found a underwater ceramic technician, which is a dishwasher. I found a transparent wall maintenance engineer, which would be a window cleaner, and a meat distribution engineer, which would be a butcher. So do any of those take your fancy, or do you go for something else?
I'm going to park those. Thank you. I think given what you've just described me as being a sort of a regular on the podcast, I should probably be the chief attention seeking officer. But I think probably the laughter sourcing manager. I'm known as a bit of a joker, really. So having said that, I won't be in the least bit funny today. But so yeah, I'm going for laughter sourcing as my job title.
Laughter sourcing architect, something fancy
architect,
like that.
I like it.
Graham, any initial thoughts, anything that you'd fancy being called?
Well, in the context of this podcast, you described Debbie earlier on as maybe being something of a stalker. So maybe I'm a stalker in waiting. But, a job title I see more of these days is futurist in residence. So companies now are more inviting futurists to have a relationship with them, obviously not as full-time paid employees, but as someone who can inform them, help provoke deeper thinking about the future. So that's it's one of those new job titles that I think you'll see more of. But for me, that's quite an interesting development as people start to realize the benefits of looking into the future a little bit more so that they're less surprised when things happen to them.
Yeah, and there's been lots of talk, and we're constant. I feel like we're bombarded with words uncertainty, and particularly in the last sort of 5 years or so. So that'd be a quite interesting one to pick the bones out of. Debbie, we want to talk to Graham about his 8 aptitudes, but just as a kind of lead in, can you just give our listeners just a little bit about our thinking behind why we decided to do this podcast today, particularly with regards to some of the work that we're doing around CPOs, critical skills, and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the comment you just made, Graham, is a really interesting one. And, I think one of my, I don't know if it's a frustration, but I'm interested in the fact that we talk about the future a lot, but in a very kind of short-term context. So I think we'll come back to some of that. I saw yesterday an article that was describing hybrid working as the new normal. And I almost lost it completely because I thought we're 4 years on. It's not really new anymore. But that's the kind of thinking. And we talk a lot about big trends. We know AI is something that's going to impact us in the future. We might not know what. But for me, it's always the challenge of knowing and understanding the unknowns, or at least having some foresight about what could be coming down the road. To your point, how ready are we? Otherwise we are surprised by change and we have to kind of react too quickly to it. Or we're so heavily focused on one. My worry is we're so heavily focused on AI, going to miss all the other stuff. So that's kind of a business context. And from my kind of thinking, we've started to look at what are some of the skills that the CPOs will need in the future. But even I'm talking short term when I say that. What are businesses looking for them to do? When CEOs go out to market for a new CPO, what are some of the kind of critical skills that they're looking for? So I think as well as that kind of business context, we talk about a couple of things. So commerciality is a key one. We don't just mean, I understand what the business is trying to achieve, but we understand how the business is making its decisions. We understand the business data and metrics. We know what that means for us, for our business, for our people, and we can respond to or proactively kind of address some of those challenges. We often see things around sort of impact and influence being a challenge for the CPOs. And that's a lot about sort of their C-suite influence, the place at the table conversation, which we've also been having for a very long time, but also just more broadly around the organization about how do CPOs really interact around the organization and gather feedback. We'll talk a bit later about sort of curiosity, gather feedback and really understand what the temperature is around the business and use that to influence decisions or have a bigger impact. There's some stuff around governance, which is probably quite, to some degree, just sort of techie HR stuff that has to be delivered. And then there's a whole piece around tech and transformation. So there's a couple of kind of big categories where we're saying these are CPO capabilities that we really need to focus some effort and energy on. And probably, to be honest, up our game. I talk very generally. There are some very strong CPOs who do all of that stuff already, but we need to up our game. So it was interesting then when I looked at a couple of things, when I looked at your thoughts as a futurist about what could be coming down the line. That's one area of interest. And the other is that the aptitudes that you're talking about to enable us for that future feed into some of that CPO capability and requirement.
Yeah, so Graham, just from that perspective, can we get a bit of an overview from our listeners on those 8 aptitudes? It'd be great to kind of get your take and tell us a little bit more about the model you put together.
It was very interesting hearing what Debbie was saying there, particularly about how to have the CPO have an even more important role at the leadership table. So I'll go through the list here. I'll just touch on them briefly because there's 8. So I don't want to spend up the whole podcast just talking about these things. And of course, I'm happy to send the PowerPoint deck to anybody who wants to see it. But the first one is curiosity, which you mentioned, Debbie. And so it's really obviously about being open to new ideas and seeking new experiences at an individual level, but also an organizational level. And it was interesting. I was recently took part as a futurist in the Tata Consultancy Services, TCS, was a survey about AI and the future of work. And it had a lot of interesting takes on the future there, and particularly things such as bring your own AI. So not even just companies having AI tools, but actually the employees bringing their own AI tools with them, which is probably still obviously quite a ways down the line, and a lot of things can happen in the meantime. But being curious, rather than sort of immediately having judgments about those things, whether they're going to have privacy concerns or data security concerns, or whether that should or shouldn't happen, just being curious about the possibilities that kicks up. Second was critical thinking. So obviously, really questioning the assumptions that we make. When we think about the future, we kind of have to make lots of assumptions. We can't start from scratch every time, otherwise we burn out. But really every now and again, we're really questioning whether all of these assumptions are still valid, and being able to let go of some of the things, being able to unlearn some of the things that we've taken as gospel in the past. And then there's creativity, which is really about using our imaginations to think about alternatives. So we can think about alternative futures, think about alternative solutions, and to really, as the word suggests, create something new. Then there's open-mindedness, which I would say at its heart is really about awareness. And so that means awareness about what's happened to us in the past and really understanding and interpreting that, being aware about what's happening around us right now and understanding those trends, and being able to be aware about how those could play out in the future. So that's open-mindedness. Then the strategic foresight, which is a bit more of a sort of muscular kind of term, which really talks to the idea of identifying the drivers of change for our company and our industry, and even for our function as well. Considering different scenarios, using that critical thinking and creativity to consider different possibilities for the future, and then having an opinion, creating a vision for the future that we can move towards. And that could be for the function, for the team, but also for the organization as well. And then the systems thinking, which is recognizing that the world is not becoming simpler, it's becoming more complex. So understanding how all these trends that we can detect will not just play out in the future, but interplay in the future, how they will start to work together, and what these new systems are going to look like. And then finally, there is collaboration, which I describe as one of the superpowers of humans. One is being able to see into the future and being able to understand different possibilities, alternative futures, but then being able to bring people together to collaborate on those. And so that's the final aptitude I describe for futures thinking.
I've kind of got a question for you, Graham, but it's kind of for Debbie as well. Debbie, I want you to answer it first. So Graham's just listed out some of those aptitudes. From your perspective and from what you've seen in the HR space, do you think that there are any of those aptitudes that come more naturally to HR people? And then same sort of question to Graham, I guess.
I think it's a dangerous game to play, because the reason I'm sort of hesitant is I'm naturally drawn to those aptitudes that you describe, which tend to be perhaps more people and interaction focused, but it's a sweeping generalization of HR people. So that's the only reason I say it's a dangerous game. Things like that kind of curiosity, collaboration, open-mindedness generally tend to be the ones that kind of jump out as a very general perspective. I think, though, when we look at some of the best CPOs or some of the most innovative kind of HR thinkers, we do tend to see a lot more of the kind of muscly ones that you described, Graham. So particularly around things like critical thinking, when we start to see CPOs who are, willing to throw away the rule book and start again, or go wild and not have a rule book, you see a really big kind of culture shift. You see a really big change in organizations. And that comes alongside creativity, for example, and then probably something around kind of the systems thinking part, because it's all very well to take away the rule book, but actually we often see that as a bit of emperor's new clothes. I've taken away the rule book, I've just slipped something in kind of under the radar. But actually the more creative ones will find different ways of doing things. So we'll see some of those more kind of meaty things in those innovative and really, I think, future thinking people.
Graham?
I don't know probably quite as well as you guys would about which ones are already prevalent in the chief people officers. But as you were speaking, Debbie, it reminds me of the need to simplify where possible. As we experience more complexity in many areas of life, we need to try to find the simplicity where it is. I'm afraid I've forgotten exactly who it was now, but there was someone in charge of HR, was reviewing a sort of massive, long how to dress at work protocol, and they cut it all out and just said dress appropriate was what it all boiled down to. And that was the new things around dress code. And so I think in those particular cases, yes, of course, you can always make it more complicated. You can always try to put in more, make it look more contractual to try to include every kind of situation. But it ignores the fact that, a lot of those things just don't matter. Looking at the bigger picture is going to be the real key moving forward.
There's another sort of renowned HR speaker on this sort of more creative side who describes how we set the HR rules for the very few people who will do something bad, rather than embracing the fact that 98, maybe 99% of our workforce will thrive and will love what they do and will, of course, adopt common sense. So I think that's all very valid. I think the other one that's interesting for me is resilience. We're seeing quite a bit of a challenge around resilience, and we connect that back to the extent to which we are experiencing transformation and economic challenge, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole on this podcast, but political turmoil, and relentlessly, for a number of years now, we've been seeing some of those things. So that resilience point comes out quite strong at the moment as something we need to focus on. So I don't think I'm not sure I'd say we don't have the skills or capabilities, but I do think it's something we need to have some extra focus on. We need to ready ourselves more for the extent of change. But I guess to your point earlier, Graham, that there's an extent to which that is driven by our ability to see what's coming, so that change is a more expected level of turbulence than just a sudden kind of bang.
So I describe it like this. So I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with the word resilience, actually, because during the pandemic, if you worked in a hospital, for example, there was no real way you could prepare yourself. Even if you knew there was a pandemic coming, you don't have enough control over your work life to be able to manage that. You have to be resilient. However, I also think about many aspects of our life, particularly if you're in a large organization where you've got some resources. We don't have to wait for things to hit us. We can look down the road. And so I always give the analogy of a dog who wants to cross the road. And yes, you could be a very hard dog and say, okay, I'm just going to cross the road, and every time a car knocks me over, I'm just going to get back up and, lick myself, and then I'm going to carry on going. But if you're a smart dog, you look up and down the road and see when the cars are coming. You don't have to wait to get knocked over. You can just be able to cross the road safely, and you don't have to have so much resilience. You just have to have a little bit of foresight to be able to see those things coming. And not only that, that will give you much more confidence in the decisions you're making. And that can be pretty big. When people are operating in a lot of ambiguity and a lot of uncertainty, it can just be like not much fun trying to make decisions when you don't have that much information to work. And so when it comes to resilience, yes, we need some resilience, but I think that we can probably get more out of trying to look a little bit further into the future and consider the possibilities so we understand when things are coming towards us.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I like that analogy of the dog looking down the road. That's quite an interesting one. As a fellow pet lover myself, when we spoke, Graham, because obviously we have a chat before we do these podcasts. When we spoke previously, we talked about this kind of idea of that long-term thinking, like why do people find it so difficult to do long-term thinking? And you talked about mindset of people thinking short-term, or even you mentioned it when we chatted super short-term. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit about what we were talking about there, and any advice that you'd give to the HR people listening in on the call?
Research shows that we really spend most of our time thinking about the immediate term future, or the ultra short term future in many ways. We're trying to make predictions about what's happening around us, which is efficient, so we don't have to keep thinking about everything and try to use all our senses to try to make sense of the world around us. The problem is we get used to making these predictions, and we suffer from what I call the Magoo effect. If you remember Mr. Magoo, the cartoon character, he was incredibly myopic, so he could only see things right in front of him. Things further away he couldn't see, and that was the core of the cartoon. He'd always get into trouble because he couldn't see things further away. And so there's this theory in psychology, I won't give you the name, but it basically talks about how things closer to us seem more concrete, more real, whereas things further away seem more abstract and less important. We have this problem, and it results in what I describe as a psychological allergy to uncertainty. And this unhealthy malreaction to uncertainty is what really hamstrings our ability to make great decisions. And so more research shows that for uncertainty in particular, they did this test on people, gave them electric shocks, and they found it was more stressful to have a 50% chance of getting electric shock than it was to have a 100% chance. If you were just waiting for the electric shock, it wasn't stressful. You knew it was coming. But if there's a chance you might do it, you might not, that was much more stressful. And so I think we are much more comfortable in the short term, and where we have certainty, what I could talk about a certainty mindset. Whereas when we try to think long term, and we have to think more long term now, we have to make longer term decisions based on more information with more obvious long term implications. We suffer from this paralysis we get from the fear of uncertainty. And so that's the real challenge when we're trying to make great decisions.
A couple of years ago in my life pre-LACE, I was working on a graduate development program. We asked the graduates to really think about what the future could be, right? So you have free reign. You can decide anything you like. And they decided on work attire. So what was the right, how that would change, hybrid working becoming a normal thing, and technology might change a little bit. And I think that really kind of reflects your point. I mean, these are our youngest, brightest minds on a global graduate development program for a huge international organization. And that's where they came to. And so it's interesting that it's so limited how far in the future we can see.
If you ask people to describe a future 5 years out, 10 years out, they will describe something that looks almost exactly like today.
Yeah.
So we can understand things have changed in the past. When I give speeches, I often start off by asking people to imagine what life will be like in 2029, 5 years' time. And guarantee they will come up with something that looks almost exactly like what they can see in front. And then I say, well, how was your life like in 2019, 5 years ago? And they will recognize that actually, oh, wow, yeah, actually things have changed quite a lot over the past 5 years. And we can appreciate that. It's called the end of history illusion. We can understand change in the past, but we can't imagine it in the future.
But I guess the challenge is, how do we shift that? So you were describing up front, a number of organizations are developing that kind of futurist role or relationship with futurists. But for those that aren't, which is probably still the vast majority, where is that skill coming from? And how do we develop that mindset, I guess, is the overall question.
I'll go back to that strategic thinking aptitude there, because that really encompasses quite a lot. And so one is thinking about the drivers of change and really understanding those, because it may sound obvious. You just go through a pest analysis and then you can see it. But you can really look at that in many different ways. When you go into an organization, you can ask sales, you can ask marketing, you can ask production, you can ask human resources. They will all have different perceptions about what the drivers of change are for that company. And you can break that, and for every driver of change, you can then look behind that and what's driving that driver of change. And then you can also break down the driver of change into different components. And so you can really get into a lot of detail and understanding all the dynamics that are influencing a particular company. And then it's not easy, but then using your imagination to combine all of these biggest uncertainties facing your organization to come up with scenarios. What could the future look like? And this is the big effort. I did a workshop a couple of weeks ago with some business leaders, and it was a 3-hour workshop, not a short time. It was tough, really tough on them to get them to think outside of their normal ruts of thinking, to consider, okay, what are the real drivers of change for my company? What are the possible futures? In 3 years' time, we weren't even trying to go big, really long term here. Even just 3 years was really tough for them to think about alternatives. We love to do the prediction. We're safe. We feel safe with prediction in the short term. And we try to extrapolate that. We try to use prediction in the long term, and it doesn't work. So stretching our imaginations to consider alternatives, the possibilities, and then setting a vision, getting really detailed. Most vision statements are just a sentence. But to make a vision really compelling, it's got to be real in our minds. It's got to be as vivid as what we see right in front of us, because the future is normally quite abstract. It doesn't feel real to us. It feels like something else. And so to make it real, we have to have those vivid visions, a strong opinion of what the future should be like to get us there. So it boils down to a lot of things. Not easy. I'd love to say that was easy to do, but it is hard. Even people who think about it a lot find it difficult.
Who's good at it? One of the things I'm interested in is, what are the functions or the C-suite leaders that the CPO can learn from? I take into account fully that many of them can learn a lot from the CPO. Is there a function or a type of person who is typically good in a typical organization at having that foresight?
So some larger organizations have strategic planning functions, and their role should be to look further into the future and to make sure that the strategy, which is supposed to be 3-5 years or whatever it is, isn't just a pure extrapolation from the present. It should consider and it should include different possibilities and build that in there, because the strategy falls apart because it has just a single view of the future. When you inevitably veer away from that, everybody's going, well, what's going on? I can't deal with it. So the strategic planning function, if it's working well, should be able to consider alternative possibilities and be able to really stretch the organizational imagination. But also the C-suite itself, or the leadership team, when they're on their away days, should be, if they're successful away days, should also be an example of this kind of thinking. And I say successful because you can also see away days, intuitively we know we need to get out of the office to be able to sort of lift our heads up and to look around and to understand what's happening over the horizon. We know we can't really do that when we're stuck in the office, putting out fires, dealing with just short-term rubbish all the time. However, some away days, they just recreate that kind of environment just in a different place. So if you're going to go off into the countryside, you might as well make sure that you really are taking people out of their normal minds and helping them do something which is cognitively challenging, which is taking them into a different mindset, a mindset that can consider alternatives. So if it's a successful away day, yes, you can go witness this kind of thinking.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And as one of your aptitudes that you talked about as well, that kind of collaboration. Debbie, I was going to ask that question too, but one of the things I was thinking about was Graham had said, like, if you can get these people to get these sort of different functions together, because they all have different perspectives, it helps to obviously collate everything into that kind of future thinking approach. We are literally out of time. I just wanted to do a quick, that's gone really, really quickly as always. We've got about 3 or 4 other questions that I can't answer, but I'm bound by the rules that we self-impose on the HR on the Offensive
What
podcast.
could the future be though, Chris? The future could be no time limit.
Exactly. Nobody would want to listen to me for that long, Debbie. Never. Certainly my wife doesn't. So we're gonna wrap up today. But just before we do, Graham, is there any kind of final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with, our HR professionals with regards to critical thinking, long-term thinking, future thinking? Because I think we touched on it right at the beginning of the pod, which was, Debbie, you were talking about AI and what's that impact. I think sometimes people get too focused in on, what's the shiny buzz type stuff. But any kind of final thoughts from you, Graham, on what little nuggets of advice you could leave our listeners with? If you only do one thing, do this.
Sure. I think talking about this aspect of commerciality, but also having influence, strategic influence, if you can confidently talk about what could happen in the future, if you could be saying, well, what I'm seeing is this, and it could play out in these ways, and we should start thinking about how we'd handle that and what our response would be. And we should be looking out for developments in these areas. These are going to be the signals of change. I think if you can be talking about those kinds of things, you are positioning yourself not just as someone who's the chief people officer, but as someone who is driving real strategic thinking at the top levels. And it doesn't really matter that it's going to be translated to in terms of human resources. But I think that kind of thinking creates real value right at the top.
Absolutely brilliant. Graham, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a really fascinating and insightful look into critical thinking, strategic thinking, and some bits of advice there for CPOs as well. So thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome, Chris. Great being on your show.
Great being on. And Debbie, thank you very much, as always, for co-hosting with me. You have been marvellous, as you always are.
Thank you.
Of course, you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to find out our back catalogue, you can check us out on SoundCloud. You can go onto the Lace Partners website. It's www.lacepartners.co.uk/insights. You can also find out our variety of different bits of thought leadership. We put out blogs, podcasts, webinars, videos, and some white papers too as well. On behalf of myself, Graham, and Debbie, thank you very much for listening to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. And hopefully, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.